Germany has been one of Ukraine's biggest supporters over the course of the country's war with Russia so far, delivering billions of euros in civilian and military aid. But Berlin just took its support to a whole new level, offering Kyiv something that it's wanted for so long: to be part of the European Union. This could change everything, drastically enhancing Ukraine's power and influence while leaving Russia and its president Vladimir Putin completely powerless. It's an unprecedented display of support, and it was officially put into writing by the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who recently wrote a letter to EU chiefs Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa. The letter was shared with news agencies on Thursday, May 21st, and promptly shared with the wider world. Merz began by acknowledging the difficult fact that Ukraine most likely won't be able to become a fully fledged member of the European Union anytime soon. It's obvious that we will not be able to complete the accession process shortly, given the countless hurdles as well as the political complexities of ratification processes. That's not what the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will have wanted to hear, as he's been pushing to have his country join the EU since the very start of its war with Russia. Indeed, it was only a few days after the invasion began that Ukraine officially applied to join the Union, with Zelensky suggesting that some sort of new special procedure be created to speed through the usual accession process. Several European leaders showed willingness to comply with this request, with numerous nations supporting some sort of accelerated accession that would grant Ukraine all EU privileges as soon as possible. Even then, however, those in the highest positions of power called for calm and warned that this sort of thing simply cannot happen overnight. Von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, said that she too supported the idea of Ukraine in the EU, but warned that it would take time. In the months that followed, Ukraine was asked to provide certain pieces of information, and by late June of 2022, the European Council had granted it the status of a candidate for accession, which put it alongside other candidates like Albania, Moldova, Serbia, and Turkey. But if Ukraine was hoping for a similar speedy resolution to the larger accession process, it would be sorely disappointed. It wasn't until December 2023 that the European Council officially decided to open accession negotiations with Kyiv, and the country had to wait 6 more months for those negotiations to actually commence. Still, as time passed, it appeared that Ukraine was inching closer to the EU membership it so desperately desired, following in the footsteps of other former Soviet republics like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which all joined the EU. In June 2025, however, Hungary, under the rule of Viktor Orban, who was long seen as Putin's inside man in the EU, blocked the opening of accession talks for Ukraine. And even though Orban has since been ousted, there have been numerous signs to suggest that full membership is still some way off. Merz himself, for example, said in July of last year that it could take a number of years, while von der Leyen said that the country could potentially join the EU by 2030 if it was able to maintain the pace of its ongoing reforms, which are necessary to meet the Union's strict standards. Ukraine doesn't want to wait that long, and leaders like Merz have been pondering alternative solutions to help get the country closer to its ambitions, which brings us back to the letter. Having admitted that full membership may still be some way away, Merz went on to write, "What I envisage is a political solution that brings Ukraine substantially closer to the European Union and its core institutions immediately." He then detailed his plan to grant Ukraine associate member status of the EU as a kind of interim arrangement before full accession can officially take place. It's important to note that associate membership does not officially exist in any EU rules or regulations at the moment. So Merz is effectively suggesting that the Union should create a whole new membership class exclusively for Ukraine, though it could theoretically be used for other countries in the future as well. The Chancellor went on to detail exactly what he believes this new status should include. More specifically, he said an associate member should be able to enjoy additional rights and protections compared to a usual candidate for accession, while also having additional obligations to fulfill in order to effectively earn those rights and protections. Among other things, Merz stated that as an associate member, Ukraine could be allowed to participate in EU meetings without voting rights. That's already a huge deal, because these are places where EU governments effectively come together to make big decisions. It's where they coordinate on sanctions against Russia, for example, or discuss how best to aid Ukraine via military or humanitarian means. It's also where they debate and decide on numerous other important matters that genuinely affect Ukraine, both now and moving forward, like energy policies, reconstruction funding, and diplomatic strategies. If Ukraine were able to be present in those meetings, then Kyiv's officials would actually be able to influence and shape discussions directly, rather than just relying on their allies to represent them and hoping for the best. They'd also be able to enjoy faster and more direct access to intelligence about how the EU is operating and the big political decisions its leaders are debating, along with the opportunity to lobby ministers and leaders in real time. That in turn could give Ukraine additional influence when it comes to deciding on the things that matter most, like sanctions on Russia and weapons procurement plans. Let's say, for example, that the EU was debating something like how best to seize or freeze Russian assets. Ukrainian officials would be able to directly explain how that move would actually impact the battlefield as part of the ongoing discussions, rather than having to rely on alternative diplomatic channels, which are often much slower and less effective. It would be a huge shift from how things currently operate, as despite having a lot of friends in Europe, Ukraine is still effectively not in the room when the big decisions are actually made. Merz's associate membership plan would give Kyiv a seat at the table, and this wouldn't just be a short-term benefit. The new EU members often have to spend significant time sitting in and learning the way Brussels actually works. Getting a foot in the door now would help Ukrainian officials become more familiar with EU decision-making practices and policies, easing the friction if and when the full membership actually comes. Merz also suggested that Ukraine could benefit from what he calls gradual integration into the EU budget. Analysts believe this could imply some sort of access to EU-funded programs and financial mechanisms. Again, the prospective benefits of this are enormous. War is an expensive affair, and Ukraine has been forced to churn through quite extraordinary amounts of money to defend its territory, fend off the near-constant Russian assaults, and develop new weapons and defenses as the war has progressed. The country also faces colossal bills connected to the devastation its towns, cities, and key infrastructure have suffered over the years, with certain regions suffering severe economic collapse. It's possible that a deeper level of access to the EU budget could help Ukraine secure the money it needs for reconstruction, new infrastructure development, industrial support, transport, and more. Of course, Ukraine already receives generous amounts of financial assistance from its European allies, but has often had to rely on the likes of loans and special financial assistance packages rather than more direct, integrated support via the European budget. In the long term, this could work wonders for the country's battered and bruised economy. We've already seen the incredible effects the EU budget can have on other nations, as European financial support has quite literally transformed the economies of Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states, to name but a few key examples. It's been used to construct roads, railways, and ports, as well as to improve digital infrastructure, education, research, and defense. For Ukraine, that level of financial access could help with rebuilding war-damaged regions, improving or modernizing some of the country's industries that have been somewhat overlooked or left behind during the war, and deepening integration with European supply chains, easing the country's dependence on older Soviet-era systems. In short, it can only be a good thing for the country's economic growth and future GDP prospects. But that's just the start. Merz's plan also includes an even bigger benefit that could dramatically affect Ukraine's chances of winning this war. But before we dig into that, this is why we make the Military Show, to explain how power really moves. If you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next. The German Chancellor also feels that if Ukraine is granted associate member status, it should include the ability to invoke Article 42.7 of the EU treaties on mutual assistance and defense. Article 42.7 is almost like the EU equivalent of NATO's Article 5, which states that if one member state is attacked, all other members should come to its aid. It clearly states, if a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other member states shall have towards it an obligation of aid and assistance by all the means in their power. As soon as a member state triggers this article, there's no need for any formal European Council discussion, decision, or any sort of unanimous vote. Everyone should automatically come together to support the beleaguered nation. In Merz's terms, this will provide a substantial security guarantee to Ukraine moving forward, with both immediate and long-term benefits. It would also send a very clear message to Moscow that it's no longer at war with Ukraine alone, but with the whole of Europe. In a way, that's already been true for quite some time, as European Union countries and others outside of the alliance, like the United Kingdom, have supported Kyiv from early on in the conflict. However, this would quite clearly take things to another level, as EU nations would no longer simply be voluntarily helping Ukraine, but would instead be obligated to do so. This doesn't necessarily mean that EU troops would enter the war right away. We wouldn't be likely to see British, German, or French troops on the ground in the frontline combat zones, as the article actually states that each nation reserves the right to determine what sort of assistance it provides. Neutral countries such as Ireland, for example, could provide non-military support, while others could help out with the likes of intelligence, logistics, and economic support. Then, those with significant military budgets in defense industries like France and Germany could pledge anything from tanks and infantry fighting vehicles to air defenses and munitions. Again, this is already happening, but Merz's plan could enhance it quite significantly. Russia, meanwhile, would have to worry about what this decision entails, as any continued aggression in Ukraine could be treated similarly to an invasion of the European Union itself, triggering the type of response that the Kremlin's war machine may struggle to contend with. In the long term, this sort of protection could be invaluable for Ukraine. Zelensky has, on dozens of occasions, stressed the importance of security guarantees. He's often said that no peace deal will ever be agreed to unless Ukraine has some sort of clear assurance that there will not be a repeat of this war and that Putin won't be allowed to simply spend a few years rebuilding his armed forces before coming up with another excuse to invade all over again. The Ukrainian president may have once hoped that those security guarantees could come in the form of NATO membership. However, the chances of the country joining that alliance appear to be shrinking, with US President Donald Trump repeatedly rejecting the idea of Ukraine ever joining NATO. Arguably, the next best thing would be for Ukraine to become part of the EU, which seems a much more realistic prospect. And if Merz's plan comes to fruition, the former Soviet state could start to be treated like a de facto member far sooner than expected. That would give Zelensky the guarantees he needs to move forward with confidence while letting Putin know that any further aggression will not be tolerated. It could put Ukraine in a more powerful position if and when the next set of peace talks comes along, which may aid Kyiv in negotiating a deal that is more in line with its aspirations, which not only include an end to the fighting, but also the recovery of all occupied territories. In the future, those security guarantees could also massively benefit the Ukrainian economy. Because even now, with Ukraine's domestic defense industry going from strength to strength, investors are still wary about getting involved with the country's economy. Even if the war ended, they'd always have the fear about another invasion plunging the country into turmoil once again. If, however, Ukraine has an EU-backed security framework with member states pledging to support and protect it, then that would help to put investors at ease. In turn, more foreign companies would be likely to invest in Ukraine, which could lead to more factories and businesses being established. That means more jobs and greater GDP growth, and even more incentive for the countless refugees who were forced to flee Ukraine to go back home when the war ends and begin the next chapter of their lives. Again, this is something that we've seen elsewhere. After entering the EU, countries like Poland and the Baltic states became more prosperous and more appealing to investors from around the world. On top of all the aforementioned benefits, Merz also suggested that Ukraine could be given some sort of assistant rapporteur role in the Court of Justice of the European Union. In other words, the country would have a low-level judicial role in Europe's court structure. This wouldn't necessarily trigger any immediate benefits for soldiers fighting on the front lines, but it still matters a great deal, as it would help Ukraine integrate itself into Europe's legal system and become more familiar with the EU's judicial standards. In the long term, this could help the country proceed with its ambition of full EU membership, because in order to become a member of the Union, candidate states have to be able to abide by a strict set of rules and standards. Ukraine has struggled in the past with issues related to corruption, oligarch influence at the highest levels of power, and legal reform issues. But with closer ties to the European system, it could more easily align its own courts with the standards of the EU. That's so important because Ukraine clearly wants to be a full and proper part of the EU eventually, but the evidence shows that this process is still likely to take several years. It's been working hard to address certain issues and brings itself in line with the rule of law standards required for EU accession, but it's still falling short in certain areas. Merz's deal would give Ukraine the guarantees it needs much quicker, while also easing the larger process of accession. It would be a both short-term and long-term win for Ukraine and a devastating blow for Russia. At the same time, there are a couple of key caveats. Merz stated that any associate membership should also come with a sort of snapback mechanism, which would allow the country's status to be cancelled or revoked if ever Kyiv were to regress in its accession process or fail to uphold what Merz deems fundamental EU values. In other words, the country would need to continue along the same path it's been following so far, showing a clear commitment to meeting EU standards and doing its best to abide by all necessary rules and regulations. Otherwise, it would be kicked out. Fortunately, there's no indication that this would happen. Even though it's still a little lax in some areas and is actively fighting a war, which obviously makes things more difficult, the country has, in the words of the European Commission, demonstrated an impressive capacity to deliver on reforms. It's made notable improvements to its justice system and market economy, while also making efforts to tackle corruption and money laundering and introducing more rights for national minorities too. All of this is vital for both the short-term associate membership plan and the country's long-term full membership ambitions. The only other caveat with this proposal is that it could be seen as a way for the EU to potentially delay or even back out of granting Ukraine full membership in the future, as it could argue that associate membership status is sufficient for the country's needs. However, Merz and other EU officials have repeatedly stressed that plans are still firmly in place to make Ukraine an EU member eventually. In other words, Merz's plan doesn't aim to replace or supplant the full accession process. It's simply a stopgap solution, a way to get Ukraine the additional support and rights it needs to strengthen its position in the war. As Merz himself writes, My proposal reflects Ukraine's particular situation, a country at war. It will help facilitate the ongoing peace talks as part of a negotiated peace solution. He adds that this is vital for the security of both Ukraine itself and the entire European continent, and seems to suggest that the associate membership could come quite soon, noting that he hopes to discuss the idea with his fellow European leaders in the coming days and stating, "My aim will be able to reach an agreement soon, and to set up a dedicated task force to work out the details." Merz even said that the Balkan states as well as Moldova should also receive additional support regarding their accession to the Union, though he doesn't suggest that they too could become associate members. Overall, Germany continues to lead the way when it comes to not just supporting Ukraine, but securing the future of the European continent. And should Chancellor Merz's plan be approved, we could soon see far greater ties between the EU and Ukraine than ever before, with even more support in even more forms and a whole host of new problems for Putin to ponder. The Russian president's panic levels are already reaching record heights after dozens of countries pledged to punish him for his crimes in Ukraine, which you can learn more about in our video. Alternatively, check out this video for some frontline news detailing how Ukrainian forces just made a massive breakthrough and could even be on the way towards recapturing the city of Pokrovsk. Don't forget to subscribe to The Military Show for even more videos like this, and thank you, as always, for watching.